Ever wondered what to look out for when trying to compose your photos? Well, in this video I'm going to share with you 5 rules that will help you become a compositional master, if that's even a word. To show you how I compose my photos, I have 3 images here that will demonstrate just that. I would just like to mention though that it's not always possible to apply all of these rules every time. However, applying as many as possible will help you create a more pleasing composition and will help lead the viewer's eye seamlessly through the scene. So let's get started. So what is composition and why is it so important? Composition is how all the elements of your scene are balanced and appear pleasing to the eye. It is important because when done well, or not so well, can attract or distract your viewer's attention and can lead the viewer's eye through an image, or your eye can get lost in the frame, which is definitely not what you want. Now, there are many ways you can compose a shot, but I like to use these 5 particular rules, and they are clearly defining your subject, your diagonal lines, foreground and background elements, elements that create balance, and also your flow lines. Now, this may all seem a little bit confusing, but do not worry, we'll get into all this now and discuss it properly. For this first composition, I'm going to use this shot from the Phillip Island. This is a shot that I got in my first ever YouTube video, and if you like, you can check that video out up here. So let's start off with the obvious one, which is our subject. And in this shot, it is the cliff in the background, which is being backlit by this amazing sunset light. When I got this shot, I was absolutely blown away with the conditions. Absolutely amazing. While the subject is kind of an obvious one, it is still very important to make sure that the viewer knows exactly what the subject is. Next up, we have our diagonal lines, and these play a very prominent role in this shot, as you can see here, with the light coming from the top left hand side and also the water droplets that have been frozen in time in the bottom right of the shot. I guess you also have the same diagonals on the opposite side as well. These diagonal lines help balance out the image and make sure that it's not too one-sided. For example, if I took away the cliffs on the left hand side, you can see how unbalanced this shot becomes. Next up on the list, we have our foreground and background elements, which in this shot will be, again, that amazing light which is illuminating the rocky cliff. That will be our background element, and for the foreground being that rock with the water flowing off of it. Now, having foreground and background elements create depth, and it's something that I'm always trying to include in my photos. Now, I could actually have focus stacked the foreground and background so that the whole image is in focus. However, I purposefully wanted to exaggerate that depth, just shot this at f2.8. When I'm looking around for compositions, making sure that I have a foreground element is so important for the way I like to shoot, and you can see that in almost all of my photos on Instagram. After our foreground and background elements, we have our flow lines. Now, these are very simple lines that guide the viewer's eye to the subject. Now, these are very important because the last thing that you want is your eye to get lost in the frame. You want it to be very easy for your eye to move through an image on a very specific path without any distractions. The lines in this shot follow the rocky shore up to the subject, and they also follow the shape of the rock in the foreground as well. Lastly, we have the areas that emphasize balance in the frame. Now, for this shot, it's definitely the rocky pinnacle on the left and the cliff on the right hand side. These help focus your eye down to the center of the frame towards the subject. For the next photo, we are going to look at this shot that I got from a hike on Mount Abrupt towards the end of last year. On the way to this hike, I was really hoping that when I got to the top, I'd be able to get a clear shot of the mountain. But due to cloud just completely taking over the top of the mountain, it became apparent that that just wasn't going to work out. So my plan was to head down to the other side of the mountain where there was this insane woodland, and due to the cloud it created this unreal atmosphere, and that's where I got this shot. So let's discuss now how I composed it. So first off, again, we have our subject, which in this case is the tree in the center, surrounded by all these other trees, and due to the fog and mist creating that depth, it makes it super easy to know what the subject is. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the video, it's not always possible to connect the dots to every compositional rule, and that's okay. And while this photo doesn't have diagonal lines, It does, however, have a fantastic way that you can easily create foreground and background. And that's by using the fog and mist to create an unreal amount of depth. And I'm going to break it all down right now. This composition has so many layers to it that create that depth, and I think that that's why this is such a powerful image. So for the foreground, we have this out of focus tree on the right hand side with some foliage in the bottom left. As we move further back, there is another tree, and while it's not on the same focus plane, it still emphasizes that depth. We then have our subject tree, and behind that we have our background that is made up of even more of these out of focus trees that fade into the distance due to that fog and mist. I did also shoot this at f2.8 as I usually do, to really emphasize that depth of the scene and create multiple layers. I really do love capturing shots like this, shots that make you feel like you're actually there, as if almost immersed in the environment. And that's why I always look for surrounding elements that I can use in my shots to really help focus you in on the subject. Next up, we have our flow lines. For this image, they are pretty self-explanatory. These lines go straight to the subject with no distractions. The fog and the mist play a huge role in removing distracting elements in this woodland environment. Woodland is notorious for being extremely difficult to shoot compositions that aren't distracting. So having that mist and that fog really helps here. Now, similarly to the previous image, the elements that balance out this shot are on either side, and these are the two trees. Now, it doesn't really matter if they are on two different focus planes, because that just adds to the depth of the scene. What is more important is there is actually an element on either side, because as discussed earlier, with one of these elements removed, the shot would become very unbalanced. Again, as seen here. As mentioned previously in the video, I like to shoot most of my photos at a low aperture. 90% of the time it's f2.8. For this last shot though, I wanted to use an image to demonstrate how these rules work on a focus stacked image. So with that said, the last shot we're going to go over in this video will be a shot from the Rainforest Galleries, and it's also a shot that I think would show just how well these compositional rules can work together. It was also shot as a long exposure because I wanted to capture some of that movement of the water whilst retaining that texture. It also worked out well that the subject is nicely framed with the trees. Next up, we have our diagonal lines, and in this shot these lines are shown both with the light rays in the top left hand corner as well as the footpath in the bottom right that looks as if it's winding round to the stream, which was perfect and exactly what I was looking for. I feel in this image everything was just placed so well, and in a way that each of the elements just complement each other perfectly. The foreground and background I feel add so much to the scene, especially the foreground, as it's the main reason why I wanted to get this shot. As in all of my compositions, I'm always looking for that interesting foreground to add depth. This is something I talk about in quite a few of my videos. The foreground is of that log that almost resembles the horns of a rhino, which is pretty cool. I was, however, a little worried that the foreground element would dominate the frame, but it is what it is. I think it's okay though. As we move up to the background elements, we also have a little bit of separation here between the foreground and background, which is super important. It just gives these two elements a bit of room to breathe, and also adds a little more balance. As for the background, everything is well spaced out and not too crowded. With the foreground being quite dominant, I think having a background that was just as busy, I think it was needed to balance out the two sections. This shot also has some pretty decent flow lines. These lines here, which I'm assuming were where the branches would have been, point towards the subject, which was so perfect. You also have this path either side of this fallen tree that wind towards the subject. Honestly, this shot wasn't just about the subject. It was also about the other elements of the scene all working together, which is a reason why I wanted to focus stack this image. Finally, we have the areas that balance out the image, which in this one are the path either side of the fallen tree, which is quite a big element in the scene, in contrast to the smaller elements in the top half of the image, where the elements are smaller but also appear to be a busier part of the scene. If we take away the fallen tree, you can see that the image will become very unbalanced, and you would more than likely have to recompose this shot. So there you have it. This is what I look out for when I'm composing a shot every time I go out to a location. And like I said, you don't always have to use every single one of these rules. Even one or two will help. However, on the flip side, rules are meant to be broken. So yeah, I hope you found this video helpful. I wanted to put something together to basically explain how I compose my shots and what I look out for. So if this helped you in any way, let me know in the comments down below. As always though, like, subscribe and hit that bell notification to be notified whenever I do upload another video. And as always, I'll see you next week for the next one.